Good evening.
Good evening.
Couple things to be aware of as we go through this evening. We are recording this. We had some people outside of the area express interest in our little class here, so we are recording it. And the second thing I would like you to do, because we are recording it, is please hold your questions until the end. Dahlstrom's has given you something to write your questions on, so when we get to the end of our presentation, then you can ask them, just to make sure we get through everything we need to get through for the sake of those who are going to watch this after it's been recorded. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Pastor Brademeyer. I am the pastor here, and of course, I think all of you know Adam and Dani Dahlstrom, who work at the funeral home, own the funeral home, run the funeral home, do all the funeral things. And basically what we're going to try to do tonight is talk about preparing funerals from kind of two perspectives. The first is from my perspective as a pastor and officiant, and from their perspective as funeral directors and funeral home operators. And so we're going to try to cover kind of both sides of that. And so before we begin, because this is a church and I am a pastor, I'd like to ask you all to pray with me. Dear Father, thank you for bringing us together this day. We know that the topic of death is a difficult one, and so we ask that you guide our conversation this day with your Holy Spirit, that we may be led to have a profitable and fruitful discussion, remembering all the while that death has been put to death in your Son, Jesus Christ, in whose name we pray. Amen. All right, so the first thing here is I have two things I handed out. One is a generic sheet for you to fill out with wishes about your funeral service. We'll run through that quickly. The second one is a little booklet here for church members that we have. If you are not a member of the church and you would like one, there are extra ones on the back, but I didn't hand them out right away because this is specifically how we do funerals here. So I thought this would be more applicable to members of our church, and I threw some at some of you who I know are Missouri Synod because, you might want to see it. So there's kind of two things that as a pastor I think of when we go to do funerals, and that is sort of the two goals of a funeral. First and foremost, funerals are church services. They are there to give people the comfort of the gospel, that is to say, to let people who attend know about Jesus Christ, who has died for this particular person, redeemed them, and overcome death for them. That's our first chief aim in a Christian funeral. The second thing is to give thanks to God for the specific person whose funeral that we are celebrating. And so because we have that sort of priority, we want to make sure, at least the way I do them, that we kind of keep that front and center. And so when we plan funerals here at our church, that's kind of how we think about it, and that kind of guides some of our decision making. So that may not be how your church or your pastor or whoever's going to do your funeral might do it. And so I guess before I start going through my little sheet here that I handed out, make sure you discuss your funeral preferences with whomever you expect to do the funeral so that you don't decide on something that they can't do because of their religious convictions or logistics or whatever else. It's a good idea to sit down and talk to that person. So you might have a great idea. It may not work for your church. That's my caveat I want to throw out there just to make sure you don't come away with an idea and then get yourself in trouble and then blame me for it. I guess you can blame me. I don't care. So when you look at this sheet here, there's a few things that I think are really helpful when I sit down to plan funerals. And so if you haven't planned a funeral recently, usually the way it goes is I get a call from Dahlstrom's. They let me know that so-and-so has passed away. They have a time to go meet with the family. The family comes in to do arrangements with them. And I usually show up at a time, when they're meeting there at the funeral home, we get it all kind of taken care of at once. And these are the sorts of questions that I find helpful to have answers to as I sit down preparing the service. So obviously we need to know your name, and then I like to have these dated so that if you change your mind at a later date, we can identify whether these wishes are old or current. So one thing that's very helpful is, favorite Bible passages for those of you who go to churches which have confirmation and have the custom of assigning a confirmation verse. It's helpful to know what that is as I prepare sermons. Something else that's useful to know are your favorite hymns or songs that you might want to know. There's a time and a place for things like poems that are not in the Bible to be read, and so it's helpful if those are identified or maybe even attached to this. So like you could literally staple them on here and put this in a safe place. Another thing that's helpful is sometimes the person who's going to do your funeral hasn't been around a long time, and they didn't get a chance to know you very well. And so if you could jot down some things about your life that are important that may not be obvious right away to whomever's doing the funeral. That is very helpful when I go to prepare a sermon. And then on the back, because I am a pastor, of course, I do care about things like baptism or when someone became a Christian. I do also have concerns about where the burial is going to be and that sort of thing. That's helpful for me to wrap my head around. And then the other thing that people often want to talk about is whether they're going to have a prayer service in addition to the funeral. Now, personally, I like having prayer services and funerals. For us in the Lutheran Church Missouri Synod, the funeral is very much a church service. It is very much about Jesus. It is basically what you get on a Sunday morning. That's a little off-putting to people, and sometimes it feels like we're shortchanging the deceased. We don't mean to do that, but that is the impression people get because, again, it is a church service and it's about the comfort that comes in Christ. And so if the family wants it, and I think this is good, to have a time to sit down and remember the person and tell the stories, the prayer service is very good for that. That's also the place where you would do like poem readings for us because we don't typically read that stuff in a church service. And so that's one of the reasons why I ask people to consider that. And so at least for us here at our church, the funeral, I hear people say, oh, I don't want a funeral. I don't want people to make a fuss over me. And I think that's misguided for a couple of reasons. One is the way we do funerals, it's not really about you. It's about Jesus for you. So it's not really about you to begin with. And secondly, it's good to give people an opportunity to say goodbye. And having a thing like a church service is a way for people to do that, to kind of put some finality and some closure to it. And so that's why I like to do both things. The funeral's kind of that final closure. It's very formal. You get to be part of something that's been done the same way for a long, long time. And then you get that prayer service, which is more informal, a chance to share memories. And so if you're worried about people making a fuss about you, the thing to dispense with is not the funeral, but actually the prayer service the night before, because that's the far more focused on you thing, right? And again, it might be slightly different in your church if you're not one of my people, but that's just kind of how we do things. These are the sorts of things I like to talk about with families. It's good for you to indicate your wishes on that either way. All right. I think that's basically all I really have to go through. My job's pretty easy.
Okay, we're going to be pretty informal here too. So we are going to talk about pre-planning and pre-funding. I'm going to talk more about the pre-planning part of it, and Adam is going to talk more about the pre-funding part of it. But I think it's great that all you guys came, because I don't care how little or much you do, but honestly, just start thinking about it and processing it, because you're all going to have to go through it one day. You, your relatives, everybody. So honestly, sometimes I start meeting with people and they only want to just do one little thing. And then pretty soon it's like I'll meet with them 2, 3, 4 times. And by the time we're done, they have pretty much all their file completed. And so pre-planning really can relieve a family to make those important decisions until the time comes, because when you get that call and you're grieving, it's really hard to make those decisions in a matter of 2, 3, 4 days. So our goal here tonight is just to share some information with you in hopes that you'll think about it. Like Pastor said, we can do question and answers here, or we're more than welcome and want to meet with you, whether it be you come to the funeral home, whether it be we come to your home. And you don't even have to use our funeral home. You can use whoever you want. It's just that I think this is a really important thing for people to do. And we believe, Pastor touched on this too, but we really believe that working together with clergy in helping to coordinate the service is just beneficial to the family. So like Pastor said, we usually give him a call. Sometimes family wants to notify them themselves, but for the most part, if clergy can make it, they are in with us in arrangement. So both of our roles, so no situation is identical. No 2 situations is identical. So that communication part of it with Pastor and your family is just really so important. We handed out these folders to you tonight, The one pre-planning sheet guide is information we'll need to gather for death certificate. We need to know things like if you're a veteran, we need your discharge papers. There's so many things that when we sit down with a family, people don't think about. It's very overwhelming. So, just like living, dying is a natural, unavoidable process. And so if you guys, sometimes people are afraid to talk about it, but just think about your kids or your family when they come in and they have to think, what would mom want? What would dad want? Did I make the right decision? How will I pay for it? Did I forget anything? So honestly, the beauty of pre-planning is that it can be changed at any time. What you want to think maybe tonight might be something. 2 months later, it might be like, oh, I thought of this, or I'm going to change this. So the biggest thing tonight is planting that seed for everybody to start thinking about it, maybe start writing it down. My mom, bless her heart, she said, she could have easily sat down with me, which she did not. She wrote all of her wishes on handwritten notes, and then she gave them to me. And she said, you're going to have enough decisions to make after I'm gone, and you're not going to agree on all of them, but my funeral is not going to be one of them. And so she gave me her handwritten wishes, and honestly, I can attest to the fact that when she passed away and we were making those arrangements, there's 8 of us. And so it was great because there was no question. This is what Mom wanted. And, we might have wondered, why did Mom want this or why did Mom want that? But you know what? She actually made it easy for us. And little did I know how many people come in, and when we can pull that file and say, all right, they want cremation, they want embalming, that's one of the first questions that we'll ask when the time comes, if you've had a chance to talk about that. And honestly, if you haven't talked about that, it's so hard in a matter of hours or to think about what you want. So that is really, something as important as that. Something as little as you wouldn't think, cemetery. What cemetery do you want to be buried at? I mean, there are so many different decisions that if you don't think about them and you only have, a little bit of time, you end up sometimes spending more time on wondering that than grieving. Because when someone passes, you're busy anyway with phone calls and people are coming in and you're grieving. So we like it when people pre-plan. Not only is it easier for us, but it really is easier for the family. And like Pastor said, working together is so important. So in your folders, there's a pre-planning history that we compiled that is some of the things that we will ask when the time comes. So when that is filled out, it makes it so much easier to have some of that done. We even like when you write your own obituary or sketch some notes and all of that. The other thing is just if you don't feel comfortable giving it to us, let family know or keep it somewhere so they know. Probably not in safety deposit box. We've had people that have put it in there for safekeeping, and then you can't get to it over the weekend. So at the very least, let somebody know, or give it to us, or just really start thinking about it. I think I really just
keep it attached to the refrigerator.
There you go. That would be. There you go, Marty. Does everybody know Marty? Well, you know now. Yeah, you know now. So honestly, I just really wanted to we're going to have a time for question and answers, or if you want to meet with any of us, we'll get more in depth in it. Tonight, I just really wanted to plant the seed because I think it's so important. And honestly, like I said, I have seen people come in and sit down with us and say, I didn't know there was this much. I didn't know we had to decide this much. And honestly, you really don't until the time comes, and it does get pretty overwhelming. So I think I'm just going to end with that and let Adam take it from there. And if anybody wants to kind of corner up afterward or something, just get a hold of us.
What if I'm not ready yet? Have you ever heard of a funeral director that doesn't like public speaking? So, public speaking 101. You're supposed to tell a joke, right?
Most of the people you work with don't talk back.
Right, exactly. That's why I'm not used to it. It's a quiet crowd. Catherine said pastor is not allowed to tell a joke, so I'm gonna, in his stead, I came up with this joke when I was about 9 years old. What's a funeral director's favorite type of pizza? Tombstone. Beer over.
Don't touch your stage.
Yeah, don't touch my stage. No, but I'm gonna touch a little bit on the pre-funding, and then if Pastor has any other words before we open it up to sharing, of course, he can step up here again. But and then more specifically, I'm going to talk a little bit about Medicaid and spending down to qualify for Medicaid. So one of the couple benefits of pre-funding, after we've gone through, sat down with you, planned your funeral, what we'd like to do is estimate off of what it would cost at today's pricing. And then generally speaking, families would maybe set aside that dollar amount. In an insurance policy is how we set it up. And then that insurance policy, it's a single premium, so you only pay into it one time, a lump sum, and then it gains interest, compound interest every month to mitigate the cost of inflation. So a couple of benefits with the insurance policy, at the time of death, all that growth is tax-free money. So you don't have to pay taxes on it, which is, I don't know if too many people that like to pay taxes nowadays, but so that's a benefit. And then just touching back on that Medicaid portion, so another reason why we set it up in the insurance policy is we can mark it irrevocable. And for those of you that may not know what that means is, by marking it irrevocable, it means you cannot change that policy. And that money is then tied up. It has to be used for funeral purposes. And every state's a little bit different with their qualification. But in North Dakota, as long as we itemize out how you would like to spend your hard-earned money for your final expenses, final wishes, off of that estimate that we put together for you, you can essentially set aside pretty much any dollar amount that you want in this insurance policy. So we have families that set aside $500, $5,000, $10,000, $15,000. I've had a few families set aside $20,000. So it's a good way to decrease your assets in order to qualify for that Medicaid portion. So that's kind of the biggest value in the pre-funding. But also, just your family is going to make numerous decisions after the death occurs. I mean, you're going to have to think about, like my mom touched on, if you don't have this in place, cremation versus embalming, you're going to have to think about what kind of scripture do you want at the service. Hymns, if you want any type of musicians, type of casket, who the pallbearers are going to be. Just numerous factors come into play, and then, of course, how is this going to be paid for? So a great gift to your surviving family members is if the funeral home can pull your file out of our pre-need file cabinet and take a look at it and say, hey, mom or dad, they had everything pre-planned. We know exactly what they want, and they also paid for everything themselves. You don't have to worry about a thing. All we have to decide is a day and a time when these services will take place. And really just limit it to 2 decisions for your family. That's kind of the main key points that I want to touch. I do have some brochures in your file that we handed out a little bit earlier. There's a little bit on this portion here touches a little bit more on the benefits of the pre-funding, and then this touches a little bit more on the benefits of the Medicaid spend down. And then there's a couple pre-planning guides, talks a little bit more about the service sort of thing. But if you guys would like an extra packet at the end of the seminar here today, we do have a couple extra packets, and then we do have a couple extra worksheets as well that we can hand out. Basically, I kind of just handed out one per couple as I went through. So, any other details that you like?
I can talk. That's what I do for a living.
I work best on just opening things up for questions.
Well, okay. Well, before you let other people talk, I want to talk some more. A couple things to consider. This is from my perspective, and I'm gonna throw this out there. I am a conservative, confessional, traditional Lutheran pastor, so that's how I'm going to talk about this. So, one of the things I have run into with families is, well, 2 things. One is we sit down and plan the funeral, and somebody says, what should we do? And I ask them, what are we thinking for hymns? What do we want for scripture readings? And this is 9 times out of 10, the people in the room planning, they look at those 2 and they go, what did so-and-so, the last funeral in the family, have? That's what they do. And then they pick the same readings and the same hymns. And it happens 9 out of 10 times, that's what they do. Or the last funeral they remember going to. And so, distressingly, there's not a lot of thought put into this sometimes. And I'm not blaming people for this. I'm not trying to make it out like everybody's kids are terrible or whatever. You can't help but, you can't blame people for it, right? Because they're really stressed out. When you lose somebody, your brain just kind of turns to pudding. And it's really hard to even think about getting up in the morning and eating and putting on pants, let alone planning a funeral. And so you don't have room in your head to think about stuff. And so one of the things I've encouraged since I've been here is for people to write down hymns, scripture readings, things like that, in order to, even if you don't have exactly which ones you want at your funeral, if you had a list of 7 or 8 or whatever, that's somewhere to start, right? And then you got to give it to your pastor. I actually have a filing cabinet. It's got a section in the back that says funeral plans, and I have about 4 or 5 of them there from people who've given to me. And Gloria Bach just passed away not that long ago, and she had pre-planned her funeral right after Dennis passed away. And when we went to plan that funeral, I went to my filing cabinet and I pulled that thing out and I opened it up, and there everything was planned out. She had a whole service done from front to back and sideways and forwards, and that made it really easy for the family because we didn't have to sit and wrestle with anything. It was all done the way she wanted it to be. Secondly, I would encourage you, though, for Christians, right? A funeral is our last chance to make a confession of who Christ is and what He does for us. That's important to us. And sometimes the people that plan our funerals don't have that same priority. And so planning it out ahead of time allows you to prioritize that stuff. And then it's not just pastor being a bad guy, right? Because sometimes pastor has to be the bad guy, and I'm willing to be the bad guy. But, if you say this is what mom or dad or grandma or grandpa or whoever wanted, that makes it a lot easier for me to sit down and talk to the family about that. And the third thing is, sometimes family stuff gets worked out at funerals. If there's a issue between two kids, let's say, and they sit down and they're going to plan mom's funeral, dad's funeral, they got all this unresolved stuff and they're going to try to bring it out. And there's two places it comes out: planning the funeral and settling the estate. And the settling the estate, that comes later, because usually in the moment it's fighting about what we're going to do at the funeral and who can, show off the best or whatever. And so having that all settled can help eliminate some of that. And so, pre-planning helps eliminate, and just to recap, it helps Christians make a good confession. It helps us eliminate some problems amongst family potentially. And the third thing is it helps us do that other thing that I just blanked on. What was my third thing? It helps. It's if you don't think that the people who are going to plan your funeral are going to necessarily do it in a way consistent with what you would expect, because that does happen sometimes. And I like to be straightforward, so I'll be straightforward. I have seen it where somebody's children will come back from a coastal area or whatever, and they come with these ideas about how funerals work, because that's how they work in California or whatnot, and they don't remember how it works up here, and they bring those expectations and want that done, and it leads to conflict. It leads to everybody showing up to the funeral going, what in the world is going on here? And so laying out what you would like is very helpful. And again, the service preference stuff, by all means, give that to the funeral home, but it's really helpful if you go over it with your pastor and sit down and talk with him or know about it, and make sure that there's a copy of that at the church if you're comfortable leaving it there, because then it's really easy when I go to do funeral planning just to pluck that right out of my filing cabinet and go. So, we like to eliminate conflict. There's always a chance for conflict at stressful times, and the more we can do to kind of hem in some of those range of choices makes it a little bit easier to manage some of that. Because you think about it, like our hymnal's laying on the table there. I walk in with a hymnal and say, what hymns do you want? There's 500 hymns in there? That's a lot to start with, right? Whereas if I have a list of 6 or 7 even, that's a lot smaller of a thing to manage. It's a lot easier to process when you're grieving.
Well, and I think that the one thing too that I want to say is it's a lot easier even for anybody pre-planning to do it now when you're healthy, and it's harder to do it when you're maybe hear that you maybe have a short time to live or something. This is really the time. That's why we want to educate people to think about doing it. I don't care if you do all of it or just even to plant that seed to even think about it. We had a couple come in with her parents and his parents. And obviously they knew that inevitably there was going to be a funeral for their parents. So they all 6 came in, and it's like, we're going to plan this going home party. We're going to sit down and we're all going to do this. So they made it like I said earlier, it is a unavoidable thing to do. So, some people don't like to talk about it. They're scared about it. They don't want to deal with it. But, like Pastor and Adam said, your family doesn't want to deal with it probably any more than you do. So it's just, I think that the more you can think about it, even talk about it, tell your kids about it, is probably the easier it might get. So tonight we're not trying to tell you to do this all tonight. We really wanted this to be a welcoming gathering, so that any one of you want to call or sit down and do more or talk more about it. I think that is really beneficial to, like we said before, to family and working together with clergy and yeah.
I want to reiterate something that you said. When we sit down to plan out this stuff, it doesn't have to be because I think I'm dying tomorrow. And the second thing is, if you're going to take the time to plan this out, actually talk with the people who are going to plan and be responsible for your funeral before the time comes. Like, if you take and fill out any of these sheets, whether theirs or mine or all of them, sit down with your kids, your heirs, whoever, and just tell them, these are my expectations. I know that feels weird, and it feels morbid, and it feels like we're kind of tempting fate, but a lot worse happens when that doesn't get talked about. And then there's all these things that people just don't know the answer to. And by the way, and I know that's not the topic for today, I would also encourage you to do that with your estate plans, to sit down with those people who are going to be your heirs and tell them, this is what's going to happen when I'm not here anymore, so that there are fewer surprises. And the fewer surprises there are, the less chance you have of things going kaboom, when the inevitable happens. You got anything else, Adam?
Yeah, I mean, just to, I guess, reiterate kind of everything that was maybe said, but you're never really too young to have a plan in place, right? I've sat down with people that are my age or even younger than I am, and we've gone through everything. They're in fine health. They don't have any concerns or anything like that, but they've sat down, they've pre-planned their service, and they've set aside a little bit of money for future use for their final expenses. And just me personally, I've communicated what my wishes are if something were to happen to me, to my wife, and just, it's good to have a plan in place, because when the unexpected happens, if it does, you don't know where to turn. So if you have that plan in place, you can just start working the plan. It's already there. You just have to follow the guide, right? And it just eases so much burden on the family. And there's so many times that families come into the funeral home and I'll ask the question, well, what was that individual's wishes? Do they want to be embalmed and buried in a casket, or were they thinking were their wishes cremation? Any thoughts there? Did they communicate that? And then it leaves the family open. Oh boy, I don't know. I think maybe at one point 12 years ago they maybe mentioned this. So I guess that's what we'll do. So just try to eliminate that stuff. And it is what it is. Life happens, and it's not something that people like to think about. So it's nice to have that plan in place. It really is, because then you're eliminating that second guessing for surviving family members. Did they really want that, or didn't they? Just eliminate them of that burden. Anything else you'd like to touch on? Or?
Yes, I got one thing that I want to make sure we're really clear on. If this is something that's uncomfortable for you to talk about with whomever is going to be planning your funeral, at least write it down and tell them where to find it. Right? I would encourage you to talk, but if you just can't find the emotional resolve to do that, at least let them know where to find it. Keep it in an accessible place. If you're comfortable, leave a copy with at least the service part with your pastor. It's good for us to know that. And unless you have anything else, I think it's probably time for questions, huh?
Yep, no, I'm.
All right. Well, Marty, you go last. Tara.
I'll start, and I'm not going to hold you to any of this, but just to get an idea, ballpark, what does a funeral plot cost?
A plot?
Plot out at the Oak Cemetery.
Out at the Oaksview Cemetery. Okay, so
How do you go about buying that?
yeah, you can talk to me. I actually keep the cemetery record books for the city. So you can talk to me. Out at Oaksview Cemetery, it's $150 per grave space. So a lot in the new section of the cemetery on the west-hand side is 2 grave spaces. And in the old part on the east-hand side of 112th Avenue, that would be considered 4 grave spaces. In that older part of the cemetery, it's essentially probably 95% either somebody is buried in those grave spaces or they're already spoken for. They've already been purchased. So chances are you're probably limited to the west side of the cemetery, unless we get pretty fortunate.
And if you're not an Oaks person or don't want to be buried in the Oaks Cemetery, they probably know who to talk to for whichever cemetery you want to be into.
I have a 5-page sheet of sextons on who to call for cemeteries.
Then, average cost of an urn versus maybe a casket, and then vaults. Do you need a vault, and what's those run? Just like some average costs, so you can get an idea of how much it actually takes to do it all.
Sure. Yep. So average cost, just like ballpark without having pricing information and sitting down with you and really drilling down into more detail. For like, if their wishes are to be cremated without any type of viewing, so no public viewing whatsoever, but they still would like to have a service at the church or the funeral home or wherever, you're probably looking maybe in the ballpark of $8,000 to $10,000. That, when I say that number, that includes items like, we call them cash advance items. So they're third-party items that we pay for on your behalf. So it would include things like flowers, if there's any kind of monetary donation or gratuity to like musicians, clergy, a reception after the service. If there's paid obituaries, like for the Oaks Times, it's $40 for the Fargo Forum. If you want to run a paid obituary in the Fargo Forum, it's like $400+, depending on the length. So there's a lot of variables in there. That's why we like to sit down with families and really plan it out, and then I can give you a better answer to that question. With the tradition, we call it traditional side of things with embalming, a casket, and a vault, all of that, and then earth burial out at the cemetery, you're probably looking at $12,000 to $15,000. And really the big difference there is that you're purchasing a casket, which is a couple $1,000s, versus an urn, which is a couple $100s. And then there's not the expense of, most cemeteries that we work with require, they call it an outer burial container, or you might say vault. So it encloses the casket to protect the casket out at the cemetery. And it's kind of a maintenance issue for cemeteries. That's why they require them, just to keep the grave from collapsing. But I can't think of one right off the top of my head, one cemetery that does not require a vault nowadays. So that's another expense that can be a couple $1,000s. So that's kind of the big difference there on those two. But hopefully that answers your question, or go ahead.
Well, I was just going to say, Tara, when you mentioned about the cemetery, another good thing to think about is getting that marker ahead of time. Because you don't know how many times we have husband and wife going to come in and talk about it, and then one of them passes. And then the other one's left to come in and say, oh, I wish we would have done this when we both said we were going to, because then it's kind of hard then for that surviving spouse to do it alone. So when we talk pre-planning, pre-funding, pre-needing, all of that, we're not really just talking, we're talking like you asked about cemetery, and then so many people now too are planning markers or putting markers out there ahead of time. Some people probably don't like the idea of seeing it out there, but there again, it's a lot easier to decide it together, because there's there's a lot of different options there too. You have the smaller ones, you have the, more upright, larger ones. So I'm glad you asked that question about the cemetery.
Last one.
Yes.
You mentioned Medicaid spend down.
Yep.
So if you're putting all these numbers in your head, what is I know for pharmacy wise, if somebody wants to qualify for extra help for prescriptions, there's this dollar amount that they can't have anything more in the bank. Do you have an idea of where that's at, what that number is when you're working?
It's the same threshold level, so you're only allowed to have, and it's different by each state, but you're only allowed to have so much in assets. So I'm drawing a blank right now.
I think it's the same as pharmacy Medicaid. It's like 18,000 individual and maybe 30 for married or somewhere around there.
So in August of 2019, Medicaid passed that law, rule, regulation that you can fully fund a funeral as long as it's irrevocable. It doesn't count as an asset. So whereas before that, you could only have up to $9,000 in assets, and the funeral expenses were counted as an asset. So today, if someone is looking at going into nursing home or spend down, it's really, really beneficial to come in and sit down with us because they can fully fund their funeral, and as long as it's marked irrevocable, it will not count against an asset. So when the death occurs, and then we have had people so we worked with one individual that when she sat down, she fully funded for a traditional service. Years later, she decided on cremation. And if you're not on Medicaid and there's money left from your insurance because she funded for a traditional service, that went back to her family or her estate. It went back to her estate. If there's not enough money in there because services are still always selected after someone dies, like you can get a casket selection or whatever. Then if there's not enough money in there, then we bill your family. Now if you're on Medicaid and have burial insurance and an irrevocable trust, if it's not all used, then that money goes back to the state if it's not all used. So that's why we have to sit down and do that itemization for Medicaid purposes. If someone is going on Medicaid, they usually say you can go up to 20, but anywhere in between, as long as it's itemized and as long as it's in an irrevocable.
Did that answer your question, or was it how many assets, or what's the threshold level as far as like assets?
Trying to get Medicaid, but you're not eligible, or trying to get extra assistance from the state and you're not eligible. A great way to get there would be maybe sit down and pay for your funeral, instead of sitting all that money in the savings.
Yeah,
is what I was trying to get at.
I don't remember how much you can have in your checking account or savings account right off the top of my head. I'd need to look it up. I don't want to give you any incorrect information, but there's certain things like your primary residence is not an asset, or it does not count against you. I think you can keep one vehicle, and that does not count as an asset for you. And then funeral expenses, as long as it's set aside in an insurance policy, which is why we do it that way, marked irrevocable, that is not counted as an asset either. So.
Did I see a hand over here?
Yeah, about a military funeral. My husband's a veteran. So do you help me then with that? Because he wants to be up there by Fargo in cremation.
Yep, at the cemetery in Fargo. So,
Question, what was the question?
The question is military funerals and burials. And I'm assuming you're talking about like a veteran cemetery, military cemetery?
Yes.
Okay, so we're talking about military burials at a military cemetery and veterans benefits.
I'm forgetting to repeat the question. So I guess, yes, to sum it up, we will definitely help you with that. It is best to, same thing, pre-plan with that cemetery, basically get pre-registered, because they'll want to see discharge paperwork, that sort of thing. And it's always easier to do that ahead of time than to worry about things over the weekend and then scramble and, okay, where did we put that paperwork? Is it in the safety deposit box? Is it in our safe at home? Is it in this drawer or that drawer? So it's always better to get pre-registered. And then we'll help coordinate with the funeral honors team to come out and provide honors for that service. And then, we can help coordinate with the cemetery to veterans receive a free plaque from the VA or granite marker. So we can help facilitate that as well. But,
Thank you.
And that Fargo Veteran Cemetery is the same as the National
Yeah.
Cemetery, so your husband would get a grave liner. They also would supply grave liner, and of course the opening and closing of the grave is because it's a national.
Yeah.
Fargo National.
Any other questions?
I was just going to say, any other questions? Took the words right out of my mouth.
Oh, I got one more.
Yep.
Like, I don't have Medicaid, or neither one of us does. So for pre-planning, can I also just hand you one of our own insurances, sign it over to you or something like that? Is that possible?
Yeah, no, that is
So
definitely.
the question is,
Thank you.
Go ahead.
So the question is, if an individual has a different insurance policy through a different company, whether it's whole life policy or term life, whatnot, can that person assign that to the funeral home? And the answer is yes, you can definitely do that. There's some nuances depending on the insurance company on how easy that process is. We work with some families that is what they want to do, and we can help with that as well.
Yeah, because we took out smaller insurance policies just for funeral expenses.
Yep.
Because we both just figured we'd do the cremations and go in the national cemetery.
Yep.
Because kids aren't around here, so.
In that we also have some families that say, we're going to keep that policy in place, but we're also going to pre-fund your services as well. And then the kids can use that money for any other expenses that might be hanging out there. If there's maybe a little bit of a mortgage left on a house, or there's a lien on a vehicle or something like that. Maybe that doesn't apply in every scenario, but some people leave that policy in place, just have that go directly to their kids, and then in addition to that policy, they would pre-fund with the funeral home. So there's no situation is identical. So what works best for one family may not work best for another family. So there's options out there. We do have some families as well that, if maybe they're not able to afford setting aside a full, like say we sit down and estimate that your final expenses will cost $10,000. Maybe they don't have that funding available at that time to set that money away. We have some families that say, we're going to set aside half of that, $5,000, and then in 2 years, we'll come back in and review that policy, and we'll fund additional funding at that point. So they'll make up that gap. So that's an option as well. So we're not saying that you have to come in and set aside this dollar amount right away, but any little bit to help your surviving family, it does help. So, D.
We have pop out the veterans, Oak Veterans Cemetery. Do you have a record of that, where they are?
Yep, I have the record books for that. Steve Frogen also has the record books for that.
We go extra, do you decide you would know that?
Yep, I have the records for the Oaksview Cemetery, the veterans portion out at Oaksview, and then I can see the records for St. Charles Catholic Cemetery, but I don't have any decision making as far as that goes. So, any other questions?
I just have a comment, and I made a note that I was going to mention it, but Dani hit on it, that when the funeral planning is going on, you're like spinning in circles, but that picking a monument about put me over the edge. And to do that ahead when you have someone to talk about it with would be so helpful.
So Noreen said picking the monument after Lyle passed away was very
Distressing.
Distressing. And you, thankfully, Noreen, kind of took her time too, which was good. Because once you do that monument, it's 100 years from now it'll be out there. So you really don't want to rush through that decision making either. I have had somebody that's come in and thinks we have to get this out there before Memorial Day. And I don't know, I think 5 years later she came back and totally got something different because she regretted rushing through it because that really wasn't what she had wanted. And of course her husband had already passed. So it is a big, and that's all just one part of it. So Noreen, I'm actually glad you've lived through it. Yeah,
Barely.
Yeah.
But my kids don't have to worry about it now. All they have to worry about is putting my death date.
Probably in a fog for not only planning Lyle's service and shortly after, but even a year or more is normal, where you're not thinking as you normally would because you're going through that grieving process. So,
not only
and that's not
going, what would he want? What would he want?
Right.
We didn't talk about it.
Yeah, and it's not something to be ashamed of, or it's not something that's wrong with you. That is normal, and it's just you're going to go through that process, and it's going to take time to heal from that. So.
And if I could add one more thing, is that you guys were so helpful. I mean, I'd get my ideas, you'd have them printed out, you look at them, you go, oh, that's not what I want. They're awesome to work with as far as planning that.
So Noreen, thank you.
You're welcome.
The seamstress she is. Trust me. You know what? It's like maybe they should be moved over just a little bit. I couldn't do one more sketch. It was a delight. No, really. But honestly, that is exactly what you should do when you see those sketches. Because like we just said a few minutes ago, you're going to look at it all the time. It's out there. So you do not. I don't care if we have to do 20 sketches. It's well worth it. The end result is well worth it, the time put in. So, yeah.
We want it to be a one-time shot. Let's keep reworking this as much as we can, because once we do it, we want it to be out there forever.
If you're worried about your name being out there in the cemetery, you get used to it. After a while, you just kind of are accustomed to seeing your name on a tombstone.
Yep.
First few times is weird, though.
Always stop and make sure nobody put the date in yet.
Well, it's not the birth date you have to worry about. It's the age date you got to worry about. Any other questions? Well, you guys did such a good job. You only got like 4 questions. Tara doesn't count, so.
Well, I don't know, but this was great that all these chairs were filled. Honestly, it it's a good thing. It's, like I said, even just to plant the seed, starting baby steps. And
That
then,
is good that you were willing to do this for us.
Yeah.
well, thank you. The church kind of,
We twisted their arm a little bit.
initiated the thought, so thank you.
Things all kind
I was in a sling for a week.
So thank you.
Mr. Orton, you did a wonderful job.
Yes.
Oh, thank you.
I want to tell you thank you, so now we can rest in peace.
And by the way, it's nice to have some laughs.
Yeah.
It is nice to have that, for sure.
I'll give you a laugh. When my dad was picking out with my sister his stone, he says, "I really don't care. I'm not going to be looking at it."
Well, it's our custom around here when we close classes to close with the Lord's Prayer. And just so you know, we all stand when we pray the Lord's Prayer for whatever reason. So we'll pray the Lord's Prayer. And if you want to stay afterwards and talk to any of us, we'll be around for a little bit. Our Father,
who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done, on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our trespasses, as we forgive those who trespass against us. And lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. For thine is the kingdom, and the power, and the glory, forever and ever.
I want to thank Dahlstrom Funeral Home for giving us their time and graciously agreeing to do this. So thank you guys.
Thank you.